So let's give a warm round of applause for his second reading of the night. Professor of History from William Wood University, Stephen Dotson.
Thank you, James. As I said with my first segment, I'm going to start with an authentic ancient joke. It's written sometime before the 3rd century BC. Of course, these are ancient, so don't expect, Eddie Murphy. Ancient joke number 2. A man said to his nymphomaniac wife, "What should we do, my love? Eat or have sex?" And she replied, "You can choose, but there's not a crumb in the house." Now for some prose. Sounds very modern, at least compared to the first one. Now here's the one that's, of course, very serious. About a serious art, a beloved art in the United States in particular, especially around New Orleans. Alexander the Great, drag queen. In my studies of the Greek version of the Assyrian queen Semiramis, I quickly found that most of her military exploits were simply borrowings from tales of Alexander the Great. I made a close study of Alexander's reoccurring use of emulation and imitation of mythical gods and conquerors. I spent 2 years studying the Macedonian king in detail alongside other academic pursuits. There is my exposure to the histories and myths of Alexander the Great. As for drag queens, my exposure is decent enough. In my 20s, I spent part of my time as a videographer. A friend told me the local gay bar was looking for someone to film their big Saturday event, Divas by Design. So for about 2 years, I spent many Saturday nights filming drag queen monologues and lip-sync performances. Those ladies were more on the professional end of the drag queen spectrum. It was not amateur night. At first, the bar manager paid me in drinks. Eventually, he decided to pay in cash, probably for good reason. I like cash more than Long Island iced teas, so this worked out nicely. Those were some fun times. I heard from at least 2 of the performers that they loved my camera work, and this was my secret. Around the entire club and around the bar are these television screens, both large and small. They're everywhere, which project everything I filmed. And if you're consistently bad at panning, or you have a hard time finding a nice, appealing frames to display the action, then your bad work will be displayed on every wall and in various spots around the bar. I was good at filming the action, but the biggest problem was the time between performances, where all you're doing is filming the curtain. I quickly came up with tasteful shots for the ubiquitous monitors all over the club as everyone waited for the next performance, looking up from their drinks. One trick, I learned to zoom into the shiny spinning mirror ball, which would create an awesome effect through the room as the glare and the gleam of the disco ball shines brightly through every monitor. The trick the performers liked was when I would capture a great close-up of the performer, or during a well-framed pose, and save it as a photograph, or what videographers call a still frame. As the drag queen would leave the stage, I would fade up the still frame photo image. The audience would see the last performer on the screen instead of an empty stage. This helped showcase the last performer and gave my product a professional edge. The girls had TV monitors in the changing room and raved about the still frame I would fade up as the performer disappeared off the stage. There you have it. 2 years studying Alexander the Great and 2 years observing the drag queen arts. One might ask, who was history's first drag queen? The answer is, we will never know. One might think British comedians have a monopoly on in the art of comedy, but we must look much further back. Alexander the Great, I found, would dress up as various gods and heroes while hanging out with his friends. He would dress like Heracles. The Romans called him Hercules. You know, the lion head helmet, the tiger fur strapped around one shoulder, and a big wooden club in his hand. What is realized when reading the list of gods who were subject to Alexander the Great's imitation is that Alexander dressed up like Artemis. Artemis, as you might know, is a sister of Apollo. She's often considered the protector of little girls and small animals. Alexander would dress up like her and ride a chariot, shooting arrows. On classical pottery, Artemis is often pictured with her skirt and a bow. Sometimes she has a long woman's robe or female-style breastplate armor. One soon realizes that one of the greatest known conquerors of the ancient world would indeed fit the modern definition of a drag queen. Alexander was a man who dressed up like a woman while performing for an audience, even though it's his friends. Historians have been questioning Alexander's more intimate orientations, but dressing up as Artemis is hardly the biggest red flag. Alternatively, not all drag queens are what you think. Some of them have wives at home. They just like to get really drunk and dance around in women's clothes. This has some similarity with Alexander the Great. For example, Alexander was a member of the Macedonian elite. The drunken and bawdy Greeks themselves considered the Macedonians in the north to be outrageous drinkers who consumed unmixed wine. While it has yet to be determined, I would venture to guess that if the drag queen arts were to fall under the realm of one of the Olympian gods, it would be the god of wine and dancing women, Dionysus, a favorite of Alexander and the Macedonian elite. Alexander, in retrospect, would simply have been an earnest devotee of his god, as heavy intoxication was often equated with the invocation of the god of wine. In conclusion, we do not know exactly everything that is implied when we read about Alexander the Great playing the role of a drag queen. We only know he must have been really great at it. Thank you. My advisor, while I was getting my master's degree at MU, is a internationally renowned specialist of Alexander the Great. So I'm sure he will specifically not appreciate my last piece. And that's okay. Ask not what your gods can do for you. Ask what you can do for your gods. Today we ask what our gods can do for us. We compare promised afterlives. We pray for help from both major and minor things. In ancient times, there was more of a balance between what a god could do for a mortal and what a mortal could do for a god. We all know about the original idea of sacrifice. One might sacrifice a delicious calf or cow. The archaic Greeks would wrap the bones of the sacrifice with fat and give it to the gods, while the assembled people would eat the aforementioned delicious meat. Make no mistake, the significant ingredient to offer the god and or gods was the blood. The fat and bones were secondary. Even Homer and or Homers spoke about the great power of blood to the dead. It gave them a taste of life again. Today, we talk of personal sacrifice, and the only thing we give to our gods are things like prayer, the singing of hymns, and dedicating our own meal to the god. I'm not going to go as far as to say the tithe goes to the benefit of God, as much it is a donation made in the god's name. Those are merely the most well-known examples of how the ancients strove to please their gods. In several cases, an ancient Greek literary figure would promise to make a regular sacrifice to a particular god for some sort of payment for help or seeking penance for a committed crime. Odysseus attempted to keep the god of the sun from killing his men for eating his prize cattle. Odysseus tempted the sun god Helios with regular sacrifices once he makes it back to Ithaca, somewhere in New York. It makes one wonder what godlike endorphin was triggered by a mere sacrifice of livestock. Perhaps at the end of the day, all the gods added up the spilled blood, burnt offerings, small cakes, and winding smoke gained by each god. If that is the case, the ancient mortals were merely appealing to the ego of a particular god. The classical Greek gods are often portrayed like extremely powerful teenagers. From my exposure to Greek and Latin classics, one thing is evident when it comes to the gods. You can actively set out to give an unknown benefit to a specific god, by making a sacrifice in his or her name. My favorite example is the Roman evocatio. Evocatio. A general of an army stops the troops outside the walls of a hostile city, somewhere in Gaul or Asia Minor perhaps, and addresses the main god of the peoples therein. With the evocatio, the general makes a sacrifice and calls out the god of the city, the hostile city. But what does he say to the god? Modern ears, upon hearing this the first time, might guess that the general will call out the local god and denounce him or her, comparing the lesser-known god to the mighty gods of Rome. This would not be the case. The Roman mentality was much different. They wanted to make Rome the spiritual center of the conquered world by bringing all the gods to it. The Roman general proceeds to call the local god by name. He tells the god about Rome and how gods who move there experience much more glory and sacrificial gain than could be experienced in such a small city. The general then asks the god to abandon the temples of the hostile city and move to Rome. Of course, once the city was conquered, the people, one might assume, would be told where they can find their god. You know the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. The roads are important, but what flows along those roads are much more than slaves, soldiers, and trade. The moral of the prose: ask not what your gods can do for you, rather, ask what you can do for your gods. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.